right, I think we'll get started today. I'd like to welcome you to our online workshop this afternoon, sponsored by Heterodox Academy. My name's Michael Regnier. I'm the Executive Director at HXA, and I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter and facilitator today, Dr. Cory Clark, who's the Director of the Adversarial Collaboration Project and a visiting scholar in the Wharton School and the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. Cory's a behavioral scientist. She's interested in how social motivations influence human judgment and empirical beliefs. And if you're with us today, you probably know that over the last 4 years, she, along with Professor Philip Tetlock, have been participating in and advocating for adversarial collaborations, a really intriguing methodological procedure where disagreeing scholars mutually design research projects to test their competing hypotheses about what's real in the world. So our workshop today is entitled Why and How to Collaborate with Your Adversaries in Science and Beyond. My colleague at HXA, Marisa Hart, is also on the line with us. She'll be helping us facilitate. But Dr. Clark, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, so I'm gonna go over, I think we're just gonna do a little 20-minute thing first. Well, I'll go over, what are adversarial collaborations, what problems are they meant to help solve? And then a little bit about how I've done them, and then also things that I've learned that I've done wrong. Maybe some pitfalls that you guys can all avoid based on my failures. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let's see. Are you guys seeing this? Yes, I see a thumbs up. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so let's jump into it. So I have my first slide is replication crisis, yada yada. The reason I have this here is because the replication crisis has received a ton of attention. Everybody knows about it. It has its own Wikipedia page. A lot of effort has gone into dealing with the replication crisis. This is essentially the idea that when scholars try to they use the exact same methods as another scholar, they don't find the same results. They're not replicating the exact result from the exact same methods. And I think this is an important problem, but I also think this is an incredibly low bar for science, that if we run the exact same methods twice, or the exact same, yeah, sorry, the exact same methods, we get the exact same result. It tells us nothing about whether the result is actually valid. And so I think we have a bigger problem where now we have this huge focus on the replication crisis, but what this is solving is reliability and not validity. So if I run this method, I get the same result every single time, but I still might be entirely off in the conclusions that I'm drawing. And this I'm calling the validity crisis. I think it's a more serious problem for science, and I think it's probably also much harder uh, to solve. But it's much easier to see. We don't need to run tons of new studies. We don't need to waste resources redoing the methods of our peers. We can simply just look at the literature and note the, I think, probably millions of contradictory conclusions. So it's easy to find papers that say things like STEM fields are biased against women. STEM fields are biased against, wait, it just says I entered the waiting room. Should I admit myself? Is this a different Cory Clark? Okay, I'm just gonna close it. Okay, STEM fields are biased against men. Stereotypes are generally false. Stereotypes are generally true. Psychological sex differences are caused by evolution. Psychological sex differences are caused by, I think that probably says culture. Psychological sex differences mostly don't exist, or biological sex isn't really a thing. And these kinds of conclusions are everywhere in the published psychology or published scientific literature. If you Google things like this effect is overestimated, you get millions of hits, which I think means that millions of scholars are probably publishing conclusions that contradict other conclusions in the scientific literature. So obviously somebody is wrong, or somebody is exaggerating, or somebody is, like, these claims aren't being made in the nuanced way they need to be. And I think this is sort of reflective of what has come to be the traditional way scientists disagree with one another. A scholar will publish X is true, they get famous for it, maybe they write a book, they get a job, they win awards. Another scholar comes along later and says, no, X is not true. Years go by, they both go back to their own universities, work with their own collaborators, conduct a bunch more research, and come back and publish the same conclusion over again. Yeah, X is true. X is not true. And over time, they become enemies. They talk behind each other's back. They fragment their peers. They create these little posses that come to hate one another. And they both die, convinced that they were right all along and that their intellectual opponent was crazy at best. And I think we can probably do better than this. In addition to like the problems this poses for science, for scientific progress, it also creates these unnecessary interpersonal failures where we come to hate people that are experts in our same field, in our same area. They're interested in the same thing that we're interested in, and they become enemies. And in sort of a best case scenario, we sort of fight with one another and reply rejoinders, and we're not really nice to each other. Maybe we try to interfere with each other's publications in the peer review process, always recommend rejection for the scholars I don't like. And really, in the potentially worst case scenario, we just pretend those other ideas don't exist at all. We never address them, we don't cite them, we don't even acknowledge that contradictory claims exist in the literature, and we just march on, sure that our view is the only one worth considering. So adversarial collaborations are meant to sort of be a better way of dealing with scientific conflict. This term, adversarial collaboration, was coined by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. And the idea is that when scholars disagree with one another, it is really a part of their responsibility to work with the person who is their intellectual opponent. They should get together. They should be willing to articulate each other's position so well that both sides are like, yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. They're not straw manning, they're steel manning each other's argument, getting to the bottom of what it is they're actually disagreeing on, mutually designing methods that both sides agree are not rigged, because one thing scholars often do is they accuse their opponents of cherry picking methodological procedures to confirm their hypotheses. When you get these scholars together, they have to both agree this is a legitimate way to test our question. They both have to commit to conditions of belief updating, say, I predict X, you predict Y. If we find Y, I'll agree that maybe X is not as true as I said previously, and commit to publishing results regardless of who wins, loses, or draws. What benefits should this have for science and humankind? So it should produce higher quality and more efficient methods. I think this more efficient part is really important because one common problem with scientific studies is they're designed to confirm a hypothesis or they're file drawered. So if I have a hypothesis, I think X is true, I design a study and I don't find support for X, I just throw that study away and now I've wasted my time and my money. With adversarial collaborations, the methods are going to be more efficient because they're going to provide information regardless of what they show. If I confirm or if I don't confirm X, I'm learning something because one side thought X was true and the other side thought X was not true. So we're going to produce higher quality methods that actually provide information no matter what we find, and they don't just go into the trash. They should provide higher quality and more appropriately nuanced information for policymakers and interventionists. One problem is scholars are currently incentivized to exaggerate the importance and the broad applicability of their findings, and it causes policymakers and interventionists to waste a lot of time and money on policies and interventions that don't work, or they barely work, or they only work in certain contexts. And in adversarial collaborations, scholars are often forced, because they're forced by their intellectual opponent, to acknowledge the limitations of their conclusions. And so we're providing more honest information to the public. And ideally, eventually they could create a more cooperative and less hostile scientific environment. So I've been working on ad collabs for, I think, about 4 years now. And although the main argument I get is, yeah, that's a great idea, but scholars will never do them. And that's a fair argument, but I don't get any like arguments against the idea in principle or that it's like theoretically a bad idea. The problem is just scientists don't want to do them. They think they should be doing them. They think it would be better for scientists or for science, but they don't want to do them. And there is some truth to that. So this is a figure of the term adversarial collaboration. It was coined around 2001. And these are Google Scholar hits. So you can see they really didn't gain popularity much at all, and still in recent years, they're really not all that popular. Here you can see Google Scholar hits for pre-registered study. That term was coined in 2014, and it just skyrocketed. People adopted these practices really rapidly and just jumped on board with this notion that we should be pre-registering our studies. I think part of the reason that pre-registered studies are so popular and adversarial collaborations aren't is because pre-registered studies are so much easier. They take so much less time. You can pre-register a study in like an hour or less sometimes. Whereas an adversarial collaboration, it is like installing a brake to your Ferrari or whatever, usually all feet are on the gas. And now you're gonna have someone come in who's challenging you every step of the way, making sure you're really making the best decisions and the fairest decisions and the most unbiased decisions. So it can be a little bit of a pain in the butt. And for this reason, I think scholars aren't doing them. But I think that it would be better for science, and I actually think if we thought about it, it would be better for scientists too. So I'll just quickly combat some of the excuses. They're hard. That is true. They are harder. They're definitely harder, and they take more time than traditional collaborations. But I think they make better long-term career investments. So probably many of you are familiar with the paraphrase of Max Planck, science progresses one funeral at a time. The idea being that like we have to die in order for science to make progress because we're clinging to our cherished ideas, even when they're wrong and even when everyone knows they're wrong. And I don't want to be that person. I don't think anybody wants to be that person. Um, if we produce the most rigorous work now, while we're still alive, correct our mistakes as soon as possible, we waste as little of our time, we make ourselves better scientists, and our ideas are more likely to withstand the test of time even after we're dead. We're not going to be that person that everybody laughs about, 20 years later because we were so wrong and so dogmatic. So I think it really is in our interest to correct our mistakes if we're making them, and correct them as soon as possible. So rather than waiting for some person to come along 10, 20 years later and show how your ideas are wrong, it would be better to be the person who dismantles your own idea or participates in dismantling your own idea, and get credit for doing so rather than someone else getting credit for doing so. And then you can move on to something that's going to be more productive, or take a turn that's going to lead somebody somewhere more fruitful in the long run. So I think they're in terms of a long-term investment in your career, they're the right thing to do. A lot of people are very concerned about interpersonal conflict. That is awkward. And I have been in some very awkward conversations and email threads. Um, but I think they actually have more potential for improving interpersonal relationships than making them worse. So when adversaries get into the same room, they're forced to actually characterize one another correctly. They often realize they're much closer than they think they are. So adversaries come into the room thinking they're like, here, I'm way over here, you're way over there. There's nothing about our ideas that overlap. And then when we get in the room, we realize, in fact, sometimes the ideas overlap so much, it's hard to even tell if there's a disagreement in the first place, or if we've just been using different words to describe the same thing, or the same words to describe different things, or, I think the effect is a teeny tiny bit larger than you do. And so often what adversaries find is that they really are much closer to their adversary than they thought. And often they become better friends. And so there's an opportunity to actually eliminate your enemies by turning them into your friends. So that's not always the case. Sometimes people come to hate each other more, but that's not the most common case in my experience so far. The more common case is that the relationships actually improve. And then fear of undermining your own research. Yes, of course, this is like something scientists don't want to do. Um, I don't think it's as risky as people think. In my experience and from talking to other people who have participated in adversarial collaborations and reading adversarial collaborations, the results tend not to be devastating. And this is partly because science incentivizes scholars to differentiate themselves maximally from other people. You have to explain how your idea is novel. Even if your idea isn't all that novel, if it's really similar to other ideas, um, scientists exaggerate how different they are from other people. And a lot of time that's where the disagreement comes in. And so when we get the results, they're usually somewhere between the two people, or both sides are kind of right. They're not usually entirely wrong. So that's an unlikely outcome to be devastatingly wrong. And again, I do think it's better to identify one's own errors. And just as like a comment on the culture of science, I really think if there's a way to adjust our attitude toward the contributions of being wrong, I think that could be really useful. Like now it's sort of considered this embarrassing career blunder if you got something wrong, but actually getting something wrong is usually a productive step on the way to being more right. And so I do think that um, we should acknowledge the contributions of people who tested things. And then we know, okay, well, that thing didn't work out. Let's move on to something else. That should be considered a legitimate scientific contribution. Okay. How am I doing on time? I think I'm good. So I wanted to give you just like a case study of one of my projects, just so you can see what this looks like. This was for a project on the rigidity of the right. So this is the idea that political conservatives are more cognitively rigid than political liberals. And we brought together a team of folks with including scholars who were proponents of the rigidity of the right perspective. We brought together proponents of the symmetry perspective, which is the idea that liberals and conservatives are similarly cognitively rigid. I'm over here. Even though I was sort of, I don't know what my role was in this, but anyway, like these are folks who think like, it sort of depends on the domain. Sometimes conservatives are more rigid, sometimes liberals more are. We brought on someone who's a proponent of the rigidity of the extreme idea, and this is the idea that it's not that people on the left or right are more rigid, it's that ideological extremists are the most rigid. So like the moderates are the least, and then rigidity goes up at the tail ends of ideology. Phil Tetlock, of course, is always participating and he's always right. I don't know what he thinks about things. He speaks in very abstract terms. I think it's somewhere like over here. And then we had a couple of moderators who really weren't invested in this question, and their role was to collect the data and analyze the data and write up the results. So this way, nobody who has an interest in the hypothesis is handling the data or writing up the results of the project. Don't read this. I'm just showing you this to demonstrate kind of what we did. What we did first is we came up with a list of every operationalization of rigidity that we were aware of in the public literature. We went through and we found all these different scales and all these different measures of rigidity. We kind of tried to classify them and came up with sample citations for papers that used that operationalization of rigidity. Then all members of the adversarial team, not the moderators, all members of the adversarial team coded every single one along, is this actually a measure of rigidity? Is this confounded with conservatism or something else? Is this scale flawed in some other way? And after we did that, we went through and looked at, do any of these operationalizations stand up to all of our standards? Like, do any of them meet the standards we all have for an unbiased measure of cognitive rigidity? And we found one. We all agreed that belief updating in response to new evidence was an unbiased measure of cognitive rigidity. So we chose this one. We conducted a lot of pre-testing, tons and tons of statements to make sure we were matching priors and plausibility on the left and right in terms of empirical statements. We pre-tested a bunch of different sources to make sure, people on the right sometimes are more skeptical of professors. So we wanted to find like professors at universities that conservatives and liberals both trust. And so we were making sure like we weren't stacking the deck against the left or the right. And then in the end, we ran a bunch of different like statements and gave people a bunch of different evidence. And it was this kind of traditional adversarial collaboration finding where everyone was kind of right. We did find a small association between conservatism and cognitive rigidity. It was much smaller than the threshold for a small effect. So not really an effect size of interest, but it was in that direction. And we found it about half the time. And we never found we didn't find the opposite. So like people on the left were more rigid. And so this sounds like, well, what did we learn? Well, what we learned is that all members of our research team were like, probably we shouldn't be making these broad claims that conservatives are more rigid than liberals, or liberals and conservatives are exactly the same amount of rigid, and instead acknowledge that it's going to vary a lot by topic, and that's what we should be focusing on. And when we want to make these kinds of claims, we should provide that information. We shouldn't just say this broad, big statement is true when it's really not. Um, and so we feel like we learned something and we feel like we came together on this issue, even if the results aren't devastating to any one side. Okay, so just to give you some uh, adversarial collaboration survival tips, these are sort of based on things that I've learned through these projects. This first one I have here, I think, is the most important one. Consider the temperaments of your adversaries. So, one thing people want to do when they think about their ideal adversarial collaboration is they want to pick the biggest, most famous person who advocates for a particular perspective. And even especially so if that person has a terrible temper and is really dogmatic. And that is not the right person to choose. Um, there are usually a lot of people on different sides of issues, and even surrounding like the big famous person. Usually they have collaborators, they have students, grad students, former students, who all share that perspective. And you really want to pick somebody that you believe is capable of doing one of these and doing one of them in a kind and fair way. And so I think like in terms of the likelihood of an adversarial collaboration finishing, this is the most important thing. Make sure you pick people who have a good temper. Be clear at the outset the project will carry on with or without any one person's participation. These days, I don't really do ad collabs with just two or even three people. I do like a team. And if people drop off, then they drop off. Um, the nice thing about this is that it incentivizes people to stay on because they know if they leave the project, all that happens is they don't get a publication. The paper's getting published anyway. You know, whether they like the paper or not, it's getting published. So it incentivizes people to stay on. Um, and it makes it so that everybody's time, given that these projects are they do take more time, it guarantees that there's going to be something to show for it in the end. So like the moderator at least agrees, I'm carrying this one to the finish line, no matter what. Um, if people want to leave, let people leave. Like, because if they want to leave, they're gonna ruin the project. So you don't try to if you think like whatever, they're just having a hard time and it's going to be over soon, then maybe try to persuade them to stay. But otherwise, I think let them go, because that suggests that they're not having a good time and they're about to get even more upset. Take notes and don't delete emails. This is, I think, really useful because one thing that happens, because these are slower, a lot of the time people will forget what they said or what they committed to. And so it's useful to be able to just look back in your email and be like, no, look, you said this thing. This is what you meant. And then you can hold people accountable to what they're saying. Be patient, flexible, and willing to bend norms. I've had to do things differently in almost all of my ad collabs, or maybe all of them. Um, because they sort of require different things. So like a lot of people who do adversarial collaborations, they end up writing separate discussion sections. Um, and editors seem to be okay with this because often they'll agree on the main finding, but they'll want to like, they have to get their word in. That's okay. I've done double pre-registering for things, um, run more studies than are intended, things like that. But, not making sure you're not approaching the project either rigidly or with like the traditional norms in mind, like we're going to do this exactly the way we do every other project, because it's usually not going to end up like that. You're going to have to do things a little bit untraditional in these projects. Restate perspectives, propose compromises, stay calm, and routinely ask, does that sound like a reasonable compromise? This is good advice if you're a moderator for these projects. A lot of the time, some kind of conflict pops up and they're not willing to negotiate with one another. And so your job as a moderator is to find the sensible compromise yourself, but you don't want to assert it forcefully and instead be like, here's what I think. I see why you guys want this and I see why you guys want that, but what about this idea? Does that seem reasonable? And so making them feel like they still have power over it while providing options that would be a compromise for both sides has been useful. Offer other objective modes of dispute resolution. I've done this many times where if they cannot come to an agreement, I'll offer, well, I'll do a Twitter poll and we'll do whatever the Twitter poll says. Or we can send out a survey to like 20 of our peers and we'll do whatever the majority rules in the survey. Or you both respect so and so. Let's ask them what they think. We won't say who wants what. We'll just tell them what the debate is, and whatever they say is what we'll do. So you can offer these other ways of solving disputes if you can't get them to compromise without I guess a fourth party in this case. Have separate conversations if needed, diplomatically. This sometimes happens also when I'm a moderator where like we're on an email thread and things are getting heated. um, it's helpful to break off into two separate email threads and talk to one side and talk to the other side, sympathize with both sides, show them both that you do care about what they want and their concerns, and then propose compromises that way when the heat's turned down because they're not in the middle of a fight with the person that they're upset with. That's been really helpful too. Frame prediction failures as updating. This one's been good. So once in a while, there'll be a hypothesis and there is no support for it. And adversaries that are the right side often wants to tell the wrong side that they're wrong. Oh, well, you guys admit that you're wrong now, and they'll say something like that. But a better framing is something like, oh, this is really interesting. You guys had predicted this, but we found this. I wonder if this is one of the things maybe you guys will update your beliefs on, focus it on like, oh, like we're all learning something together and you're changing your mind like a good scientist should when they get new evidence, and framing it in a more positive way as opposed to you're wrong or you were wrong. Refocus the project away from adversaries and toward the question. When things get heated, adversaries tend to turn things personal and inward, and they make it about themselves as though the scientific community cares about who was right rather than what was right. And even will start using their own names in like the discussion section, like we said X and they said, it's helpful to discourage that entirely. We don't talk about who is right or who is wrong at all. And we don't even mention like who is right or who is wrong about what. Instead, we just say, this is what we found. We found this percent of the time with this effect size. It doesn't matter who forwarded it. And that can be really helpful. And then refocusing the project toward agreement and what we've learned. So what will generally happen with these, in my experience, is scholars will converge on the findings. They'll all agree on the findings, but they still will slightly disagree either on like the interpretation or like how big, like how significant is the finding? Is it a really big deal? Is it not a big deal? That kind of thing. But I think focusing on like what we have come to agree on is useful too, because then it kind of makes everybody feel like they're part of the same team, at least for that part of the project. Anecdotal delights. So these are just some of the things that have surprised me from doing these. Disagreements, I think, always start off smaller than they appeared. Adversaries are almost always surprised at how little they disagree with their adversary when they finally start talking to them, that adversaries will come together on specific findings. And the interpersonal thing also has been surprising. There are people that literally in the past at conferences, if I saw them, I would duck and hide behind like a pillar so as not to bump into them. And now I'm texting them to meet up for a drink. So that's actually a really nice benefit because a lot of scientific conflict is so unpleasant that it makes like conferences and other things really tense. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like those could be, everybody could be our colleague, if we were able to work with them. So I think that's a positive aspect too. And then ultimately, I really think I don't want to be a Pollyanna. I don't think we'll ever have this like kumbaya, harmonious, we're all in it for the search, like collective search for truth. You know, we're all allies. I don't think we'll ever get that. Humans are competitive and competing for status. However, I do think the current norms of science really incentivize this kind of I'm right, you're wrong, maximum differentiation, show how the people who came before you were stupid, how you're better. Um, and people have this tendency to fragment off into these little subgroups and they come to dislike one another. And I think that can be the extremists among scientists. It doesn't have to be the norm. And we really could, the norm could be that when we disagree with people, people who are also experts, who have our same degree, our same area of expertise, published in the same journals, we say, wow, like you know a lot about this topic. I know a lot about this topic, yet we disagree. That's so interesting. What's going on here? Then you work together and you make each other better scientists, rather than trying to destroy each other's career. Again, it's not going to be like that entirely, I understand, but I think it can be more that way. And I think if we had this expectation for scholars to work with their adversaries, and this was the norm, then we could move toward that direction, and that would potentially be a more pleasant and more productive scientific environment. Before I take questions, I wanted to briefly mention that I have $4,500 available for it's the Brian Labatt Open-Minded Early Career Researchers Award. This is an award that's supposed to go to two or more early career researchers, and by that I mean like grad students, postdocs, or early assistant professors to conduct an adversarial collaboration. It doesn't have to be only ECRs. It could be ECR and their mentor or something, but there should be ECRs from at least two sides participating in this. So if anybody in the room is interested in actually doing an ad collab and you have ECRs or you are an ECR, I would love if you would consider applying for this. I want to give this money away ASAP. So send me an email if you think you could put this to use. So the $4,500 is for a data collection, or it could be for however many data collections you want. But it is for data collections for an adversarial collaboration. So I hope I'll hear from some of you on that. Yeah, and I'll take any questions people have.
Well, Corey,
I
we
guess,
have
should
a
I
couple
stop
of
sharing?
questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I can start with a couple of those.
Sure.
Quick, clarifying question. Can you clarify what double pre-registration means?
Oh, yeah, for that one, we pre-registered our study. And then while the data were collecting, the one side decided that they wanted to update their hypotheses. And so then we did a second pre-registration while we were running the data collection. Not a normal thing to do, but it was really important to them to do it. And we didn't care, so we did it. Did that one get published yet? Not yet. So I don't know if it will end up being a problem with the editors, but yeah.
Another clarifying question. Can you please clarify the institutional support and infrastructure necessary for adversarial collaboration?
Um, so I don't know that there's anything necessary. I think it would help if there was a little bit more understanding among editors and peer reviewers. Some editors and peer reviewers really seem to value adversarial collaboration and are more interested in publishing them, and they've even said as much. And I think I can send this around. I've been collecting a list of journals that have specifically put out calls asking for them. But some don't because the norm is to publish these like big, broad, flashy, important findings. And adversarial collaborations are often not going to be like that. They're going to be like more nuanced and small and more correct, but not as exciting. And I think some editors and reviewers like don't understand why that's a problem. And so I wish there was a little bit more understanding on that. So in some cases, I feel like adversarial collaborations are punished in peer review. Sometimes I feel like they're rewarded. So that's potentially an issue. And then yeah, like I think in my experience, funders actually have been more positive toward them, so that's been useful. I think if you're applying for funding from an organization that actually cares about solving problems and not pushing an agenda, then they should be more interested in adversarial collaboration, so that's helpful too. Um, but yeah, I think it takes more understanding all around. Would take more understanding too, especially for young folks because they do take more time. Um, and so you would potentially not be expected to publish as many papers if you were doing exclusively adversarial collaborations. But I would probably advise ECRs to diversify and, try some of these and keep plugging away at other projects too.
Um, and ECR, of course, is early career researcher, in case anyone missed that on the slide.
Oh, just differences in values as opposed to data theory opinions. If I believe X value passionately, want Python, but might do research for. Yeah. Value differences. So adversarial collaborations, I think, are mostly only going to be useful um, for empirical disagreements. Values often are related to empirical disagreements. Even take something like abortion. People might have different views for value reasons, but there are many empirical claims surrounding abortion that are related to what you might think are the optimal policies. So I think adversarial collaborations are useful for um, understanding the natural world. I don't think they're necessarily useful for negotiating our values and any kind of like, well, they could do normative things that are based on empirical conclusions. But yeah, I don't know if this would be that useful in philosophy or when it comes to like moral disagreements, unless it's a moral disagreement that depends upon an empirical disagreement. So that would be a whole nother beast.
The simple fact of adversaries who have different values, if they're doing empirical work, I take it that, that question of temperament would be the key
Mm.
question rather than merely that they might have differing values. Is that
Yeah, some people have like, so some people seem to think that an adversarial collaboration would mean like bringing together liberals and conservatives, and I don't think that that's necessary at all. And that's actually one positive aspect of adversarial collaborations is like, given how ideologically skewed academia is, there aren't all that many conservatives to pick from. But because academia incentivizes disagreement, there usually are people who disagree with any one empirical claim.
Mhm.
So even when it comes to perspectives that are like pro-left leaning perspectives, there are people who will take the opposite of that, even if they're not conservatives themselves. Um, so I think like focusing on the disagreement at the issue, at the level of the empirical claim rather than the entire ideology, is helpful. Um, that said, I do think it would be cool if liberals and conservatives would collaborate too. That could be really useful. But yeah, as you were saying, temperament matters. So like people who think everyone who's in the opposing political party, if they think they're all terrible human beings, that's not going to be a person who's going to be capable of a productive adversarial collaboration with an opponent, I wouldn't think.
Maybe we can squeeze in one more question. A couple of participants asked about um, psychology. So it seems like there's a lot of this work has been in psychology. Can you speak to adversarial collaborations in other sciences or other social sciences?
Yeah, so I am in psychology, which is why I have psychology-centric references. Um, but so I do know a lot of sociologists are interested in this, philosophers too. Academy of Management is now interested in this. I think their perspectives are going to put out a call very soon. Um, uh, it is relevant everywhere. I have talked a handful of times with I think it's called the something with nutrition research. So they've been really interested. There's a lot of debates in nutrition research, um, about, like, does exercise work and how bad are super processed fruit foods or whatever. So I think it's probably relevant everywhere. And in fact, I think it could be really fruitful in areas that aren't as morally charged. Although I do understand that debates get heated everywhere. I've had some folks email me about debates in their areas, like about butterflies and things. Um, and it gets really hostile. Like you think, well, it's not about anything political, so it's probably really nice over there. But no, scientists get into heated fights. It seems about just about anything. But yeah, I think any science that is or any area that is a discipline that deals with empirical claims, and especially empirical claims that are depending on the collection of data, like adversarial collaboration could be helpful in
Right.
any of those areas.
Great. Well, welcome back. I hope that was a useful exercise. Cory, do you have any quick reflections on the rooms you were in or anything you want to say?
I was in the DEI one and we didn't quite finish. But yeah, probably this is something that almost everybody is interested in. So if other people wanted to weigh in too, we were thinking about like what data are already available that we could look at to um, see how beneficial are these policies. And we were thinking Heterodox Academy, of course, has data, Fire has data, but other sources might too, that you could do longitudinal comparisons and then between institution comparisons, um, to see which kinds of institutions actually are like best serving their students. That was one
Great.
possibility.
I think we've got a little time for some discussion and Q&A. Marisa, what's the best way technically to do this? Should we have questions in the chat?
That, or if folks just want to raise a hand
Okay.
here in the meeting and share what they thought they learned.
Do we?
Yeah,
Tim?
Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up on some of the points we were discussing in the DEI conversation and try to maybe broaden it out to apply to any topic, but sort of kind of where I was headed in making a point was about trying to understand in an adversarial conversation, who are my adversaries? And then sort of steel manning, what is the most generous, charitable version of what my adversaries are trying to accomplish, and spending some time trying to identify that so that at the end of the day, it's easier to ask someone to join in this cooperative enterprise of here's what I think you want, or tell me what you want, and here's how the adversarial collaboration could help us get there, because I might want the same thing at some level, just want different trade-offs involved.
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I know this is before everybody else's time, but in the 1970s, I was involved in race relations instruction in the Air Force. And the question was just the integration, racial integration, and the reactions to it. And when I first went into the program, it was clear that it wasn't working, in that the attitudes that people expressed in surveys became more polarized rather than less polarized after the mandatory training. And I think that same thing came up in the survey that I did on attitudes towards hostile environment at Berea College just a few years ago. And so DEI is such an expansive program. Maybe it would be useful to focus on just required DEI training, and then look at the effects and the amount of variance that's a consequence of the program is a good indication of whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. But if you're trying to indoctrinate rather than educate people, you're likely to get that polarization effect where the variance increases after the program. The true believers become more true believers, and the skeptics became downright antagonistic toward it.
Well, so Cory, this is really kind of the art of this, right? Is defining a precise enough claim and people who disagree about it. Maybe sometimes that just surfaces how much scholars are talking past each other, like some of your early slides.
Yeah, I think often, we think of like who are the major proponents who are the major opponents of these kinds of things, and they often focus on different things precisely for that reason, because the ones who like DEI, they're going to focus on what are the good aspects, and the people who don't are going to mock the bad aspects. And that's why I think it's useful to get people together, in a room who actually have the different perspectives and see if we're even disagreeing on the same thing in the first place, because sometimes we're not. And that would be hard because DEI is such a massive beast, So is it the trainings? Is it the language we use on our websites? Is it, different kinds of like inclusive groups we have on campuses, things like that, and different people might have different perspectives. We talked about Lee Jussam's paper. He would be I suppose, an opponent. I don't know how many people would want to work with him, but it would be easy to find his adversaries just by looking at who's been slamming his paper on Twitter as the proponents.
Anyone else? Gary?
Hi, everyone. I'm guessing I'm the only veterinarian in this group, and I apologize for asking a vet-specific question, but I'm current president of the Evidence-Based Veterinary Medical Association. And as you might imagine, we're big fans of evidence-based medicine. One of the biggest challenges we have is there's a fair number of veterinarians who practice what most of us would refer to as alternative therapies, many of which have been conclusively scientifically debunked, some of which over 200 years have just never shown their validity, but there's still many veterinarians who are practicing them. And one of the challenges we have is people who believe in some of these therapies believe in this to the extent that it is almost religious. It is beyond the ability of anyone who believes in Western medicine to comprehend. It shouldn't be subjected to the traditional scientific method. Doing traditional research on it is useless because, things like Reiki energy can't be measured in a way that a scientist like myself want to do. So how do you approach organizations or individuals like that when the playing field is in two different cities? Like, how do you come to a place where, because I've said, let's take a disease process we both agree exists, and 20 of them will get treated by traditional Western medicine, and 20 of them get treated with Reiki, and we can follow them out. And they said, nope, that's not going to work, because the methods that you're proposing for scientific, objective realities that I would argue are simply not stuff that can be measured via the alternative therapies that we practice.
Well, that's hard. Do they agree though that there's a measurable outcome that they're trying to accomplish? Like Reiki is causing X,
Yeah,
without joint problems or something.
Yeah, the problem, of course, is many diseases have a waxing and waning course, right? And so a response to Reiki could just as well be chance. And so you need to find diseases that are, objective illnesses, like you said. Do you have severe arthritis, and a uniformly accepted pain standard is accepted to do the research on, and they do Reiki, and we would do something else. But we've yet to been able to engage any of these organizations in doing that. And the other concern, of course, is anyone who knows anything about statistics is, once in a while, you're going to get a study that seems to show alternative therapy may work. And that doesn't mean it works all the time, but just if you look at meta-analyses and systematic reviews, you know that Reiki and things like homeopathy really are, at least in humans, a placebo effect, but there's very little chance for a placebo effect in animals other than the impact on the pet owner.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be hard because again, these are for like empirical disputes, and if they're not willing to participate in the empirical thing, then I don't know what to say about that. But if they think that their Reiki or whatever treatments they're offering have benefits, then those benefits must be detectable. So they're at least admitting that there's some kind of measurable benefit. So that would potentially be a place to start. Look, we can't measure Reiki. We can't measure what's energies are moving where, but we can measure the outcome that you're trying to create. And then I would also say maybe like getting someone that they trust to propose the idea first rather than somebody they perceive as hostile. I don't know if you could get that person, but somebody who is maybe like an on the fence person who does accept science as like the most legitimate way of testing things, but also is sympathetic that there are like these mysterious things that we don't know, like how they work or like if they work, and it's totally possible that Reiki is doing something. So like someone like that and getting them to agree. And I will say, one of the first ever adversarial collaborations, wasn't called an adversarial collaboration, it was in like 1970s, was on essentially is it telepathy? It was on like, can I transfer a message to your brain while I'm in another room or something
Yeah,
like that.
there were studies where people would pray for other people in a hospital.
Okay, yeah.
And they showed that the people praying shockingly couldn't impact on the prognosis.
I
even
know
though
that
people
one,
swore,
but this is a different one where it was about whether I can communicate like a number to a person in a
Oh,
different room or something. But what was funny about that one is they didn't bother getting a moderator. And so what they ended up finding is that when the person who was a skeptic ran the studies, there was no effect. And the person who was a believer ran the studies, there was one. And so they couldn't they couldn't agree. So you need to have that moderator that both sides trust that say, I'm gonna oversee the process and I'm gonna, make the claims. So I I have hope for you, but that's a tricky problem.
well, the bigger question for me is when do you cut your losses? There are certain situations where you have to look in the mirror and say, this is going to be an exercise in futility. And it always makes me feel bad when I get to that point. But I think sometimes that is the right place to go because you're going to bang your head against the wall forever without,
Well, even if you can't persuade them, you potentially could persuade patients.
Yeah, that is where our focus
You're
is.
like,
People on the fence in the
here's
public.
the outcome of this procedure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a thought about that, Gary.
Yeah.
So I'm Dave Paul. I'm a philosopher, but I also serve on two IACUCs, one at a university and one at Zoetis. And it occurs to me that it might be worth talking to folks on the animal welfare side to see if you can find anybody who might be willing to say, you know what, we could aim for a study that's looking at not like whatever does this kind of Reiki ameliorate that kind of disease, but maybe focus on animals that are in palliative care and see whether maybe the care that's being provided by the people who claim to be practicing some alternative kind of medicine, maybe just the attention they're giving the animals does have some beneficial effect. Okay, fine. So maybe somebody who's a non-vet, right? I'm a non-vet, but I work with vets all the time. Maybe somebody who's a non-vet, a non-scientist on an IACUC might have some ideas and might have some ways of trying to engage a research question that's a little different than what you might be aiming for, that maybe the alternative practitioners might buy into.
Right.
Just a thought.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. One of the big challenges, we have in veterinary medicine is we often rely on the pet owner to share their assessment of how a pet is responding. And once an owner is enrolled in a study, there is plenty of evidence to say they want to believe, right? They want to report back positive results. So there is a placebo effect in that regard, not so much on the animal, but from the pet owner. So it makes it a lot harder without objective measures, blood work or heart rates or whatever objective blood tests you want to do to assess if an animal's in palliative care is doing better. But yeah, I get your point. That's not crazy.
Great. Well, folks, I think we're gonna have to move towards wrapping up. Cory, do you have a final headline or thought to share with us before we do our last few announcements?
No, only that it makes me happy to see that there's interest in this idea. And it can be overwhelming, but I think they're very possible, and they do get easier over time, and they get to be fun over time, and you also end up with a lot of pretty good stories. So I encourage you all to give them a try. And you can always reach out to me by email if you have questions, or you're dealing with a impossible situation and you need advice. I'd be happy to give you whatever wisdom I've gained by this point.
Great. Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking Dr. Clark for spending this time with us. Her email is in the chat, especially if you're interested in those funds that are available for adversarial collaboration work by early career researchers. I also want to mention Cory and many folks affiliated with Heterodox Academy will also be getting together in person soon, actually in Los Angeles next month. There's a conference being held at USC on censorship in the sciences, interdisciplinary perspectives. Marisa, maybe we can drop that link in the chat, but this is a great conference over 3 days. Tickets are on sale, and it's not about this exact set of topics, but closely related in terms of how beliefs can get in the way of research sometimes. So we hope that you'll consider joining us there. We'll also have live streams available, and it's shaping up to be a terrific event. We're proud to be a lead sponsor of that event at HXA. I would also just say, I hope you all are aware that as HXA members, we have a lot going on. We have online communities now that are set up. We have a new Substack account with information going out, and a brand new magazine called Inquisitive, which will be a quarterly periodical. So if you haven't been to heterodoxacademy.org in a little while, I hope you come visit and check out everything we have going on. We're a membership organization, and we're really benefit so much from our members, volunteers, contributors, volunteer leaders, and so forth. So yes, thank you very much. We really appreciate the time, and thank you, Cory. If you're wanting to view this video, it'll be on our website in the workshops section. Is that right, Marisa? Where can people find this
Yes, it'll
recording?
be, if you're logged in as a member on the website, you can access that in our workshops, and you can see all workshops that we've done for members online.
Great. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. It was nice to meet you guys.